Hello and welcome to another episode of Green Time. I'm your host, John Hickey with the Missouri Sierra Club. And on today's episode, we're going to be talking about the United Nations climate talks, both the recent talks in Paris as well as a previous conference in Warsaw, and finding out the experience of local youth who attended those conferences to address the issue of climate change. And to help us do that, we have Rachel Westrate here with us, who's a student at Washington University, who attended the Warsaw talks in 2013. And then Natalie Lucas, newcomer to St. Louis, who attended the Paris talks that just ended a couple months ago.
Yeah, and I've gone to a couple of other ones too.
Oh.
Yeah, since Doha in 2012.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
You're an old pro at this.
Yeah.
Well, then let's start with you, Natalie. What happens at these things? I've never been to one.
So essentially there are two components of the conference. There is an actual conference style where people are giving presentations about what's going on around the world around climate change. But then there's the component called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And that group and body of parties from all around the world come and discuss climate policy, specifically related to how we can prevent anthropogenic climate change or human-caused climate change. Yeah.
So is that the squad that's like sitting there scribbling away trying to write up a treaty deal that people can sign on to?
Yeah, it's like an action-packed 2 weeks of a lot of policy, and it's an interesting experience. Like you have to go once or twice to really get the hang of things and really know what's going on. And then once you start figuring out, you can try to influence the policy.
In how many countries?
It depends on the year because parties add themselves and all the time. And so this year I believe it was 196.
Which is got to be most of the countries in the world, right?
Yeah, there's only a few that aren't actually part of the UNFCCC.
And Rachel, what was your experience?
Yeah, so I went to Warsaw, Poland, and was a student delegate through Washington University. And what we mostly focused on was doing specific research when we were there. So instead of focusing sort of on the high-level policy rooms, we attended a lot of side events, which is what Natalie was talking about, sort of the other events that are going on where people do presentations about things that are going on around the world. So while I was there, I was specifically focusing on RED and RED Plus, which are two forestry development programs, specifically in Brazil. So I was going to a lot of side events hosted by panelists from the Amazon region and discussing what they were doing to prevent deforestation and how their countries were implementing reforestation practices to help not only as a carbon sink with the, trees being able to help take in carbon, but also helping their local economies and making sure that the indigenous people of those regions were not being affected. So when I was in Warsaw, we mostly focused on that. We also had another group of student researchers that were doing some of the climate finance work, seeing how where the money was coming from that's going to influence these agreements and how we can implement them afterwards.
Wow, I know there was J.P. Morgan just announced recently that it would stop investing in coal mines, except for in very unusual circumstances, which sounds like the fruit of what you all were trying to achieve.
Yeah. It's really cool. And it's not only sort of an international thing that is talking about, how are we investing our money, but also United States and a local thing. I think a lot of businesses now are realizing that coal and fossil fuels are not great investments anymore, and divesting from them is actually a smart business move, not only a smart environmental move. So that is sort of part of what we were looking at. And then there are a bunch of different climate finance mechanisms within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Conference of the Parties. So they try to get money from developing nations in order to sponsor, or from developed nations in order to sponsor climate action in developing nations. And so there's a lot of talk, and there was a lot of talk, I know, this year at Paris at what are developed countries supposed to do in order to support developing nations. And so that is a large part of the climate finance program as well.
Was that a discussion that you were involved in Paris just go around, this whole idea of what developed countries' responsibility is for those countries that lack the energy infrastructure and finances to
There was
do
a
it?
lot of that talk. There was a lot of talk around finance, but also just moral obligations and things like that. This year, there was the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which was specifically developing nations that came together to create a bloc, like kind of a negotiating bloc, and try to work to get a mention of being below 1.5 degrees Celsius global warming on average, as opposed to the 2-degree limit that we have now. And because of that block, we were actually able to make sure that happened, and that was actually put in the Paris Agreement. And so there was definitely a lot of discussion from developed and developing nations about like who's responsible for what, and it actually has a term called common but differentiated responsibilities, which is really boring talk for like how much should the developed countries put up in terms of finance. There's a Green Climate Fund that has a goal of getting $100 billion by 2020, and businesses, foundations, countries are all trying to contribute to that. The United States has put in, I think, $500 million just this year. And so we're really excited to see like countries starting to step up to the plate. The EU is always a good champion on that. Now that Canada has a new prime minister, we're getting much better results from Canada as well. And so we're inching forward in a lot of really great ways, and it's really been like the movement and the people who have like really made this a possibility.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, this is fascinating. We're going to take a quick break, though. We're going to watch a short video that looks back at 2015 and some of the campaigns and victories that the Sierra Club was involved in, and then we'll be right back. Hello and welcome back to Green Time. I'm your host, John Hickey with the Missouri Sierra Club. Today we're talking with local students who have attended some of the recent United Nations conferences on climate change, including the one that recently concluded in Paris. We've got Nick Annin from Washington University, who attended the Paris talks, and then Natalie Lucas, who attended not only the recent Paris talks, but several other talks before that. So as the newcomer to the set, Nick, let me ask you first, what was your impression of Paris and what you saw at the United Nations conference there?
Yeah, so it was my first conference, so I didn't really have a standard to base it off of. But we did a lot of research and talked about what previous conferences had gone through. And I think that the biggest differences at this conference were, first of all, there were INDCs, which is an acronym for International Nationally Determined Contributions. And so what those are is that prior to the conference, all of the nations who were there had already hashed out a plan for how they were going to be reducing their carbon emissions. So it really accelerated the negotiations once they had arrived. Another major point that I saw as being different at this conference was the role of the private sector. A lot of people were talking about how the private sector was on board this time, specifically comparing it to Copenhagen, where they got really close to creating an agreement, but it fell apart at the end. I think having the role of the private sector where they were on board with a climate agreement is something that allowed governments to actually negotiate and create the agreement that we saw at the end of the conference.
So, for example, in the United States context, the EPA Clean Power Plan would have been the U.S. Contribution, where the Clean Power Plan was done and rolled out before the Paris negotiations started.
Yeah.
And you're saying that other countries similarly did their homework before they showed up and had proposals to present to show good faith.
Yeah, and not only were those contributions something that were laid out that sped up the negotiations, but as you said with the Clean Power Plan, it was really important that the key players, the largest emitters in the world, had nailed down concrete contributions, because until those key emitters, the biggest emitters, make a contribution, the smaller emitters aren't going to. Because if they have a very small carbon footprint and they're reducing their emissions by 20%, they're not going to be interested in doing that unless the biggest emitter, China and the United States, are also doing some serious action to help create a climate solution.
And did you see a difference in Paris compared to some of the other previous conferences you were at, Natalie, that jives with what Nick saw?
Yeah. For example, the United States used to be really defensive and not very movable, and same with China. I remember there was one conversations where they were talking about whether it should be commitments or contributions related to the INDC, and they argued about it for 2 hours between just the United States and China, pretty much, with other countries popping in. And this year,
just what word you used, whether you called it
contributions or commitments, which actually has a lot of different legal implications, but really took a big chunk of time. And this year, China kind of held back. The U.S. was actually championing a lot of issues, which was unheard of in a lot of cases before that. This was the first administration that really got serious about things. And I think Obama learned from Copenhagen, where that treaty fell apart that Nick was talking about. He learned never to do that again. And so this year was all about trust building. I think you nailed it, hit the nail on the head with that. Yeah.
So what I hear you saying, Natalie, is that the fact that President Obama has shown leadership on climate issues was one of the key ingredients that made Paris a success.
Right. And the UN, the U.S. and China agreements, they made one in 2014, and then another one is kind of boosted in 2015. President Xi Jinping from China also made significant contributions, has started closing down coal mines. That you can see that these people are making significant changes. Prime Minister Modi has started to make changes in India. So the big players that everyone is talking about really has tried to put something on the table, and I think that's what made this agreement different than any other.
Speaking of India and China, those are two places where the big cities have air pollution problems that are extreme. I know we often hear about Beijing, but my understanding is actually Delhi's worse than Beijing. Did that come up at all? Were there either from the governments or non-governmental organizations talking about the public health impact of air pollution from coal?
Yeah, they talk about it a lot.
Yeah, I think that it's really, however sad it is, it's really important to have people able to experience the negative effects of this pollution and climate change. I know that specifically talking about China and Beijing's air pollution, since that has started affecting people on a daily basis, the support from the general population has become much stronger to really tighten down on power plants and really reduce these emissions because it's affecting their everyday lives. And what's ended up happening is that it's actually a huge public health risk, and it's killing hundreds of thousands of people, and it's a quality of life issue as well.
Right.
So however sad it is, it's really important to get these issues on a political agenda, and if people are experiencing negative effects in their everyday life, that's one of the best ways to get it on the agenda.
And people in China are completely aware. One of the Sierra Club's biggest tools was working with Chinese youth this year. And so we had a U.S.-China youth statement. And then I also went to a conference in Shenzhen, China this year. And listening to the youth from all around China, you can tell that this is a huge issue for them. And they know it's coal, and they know they want to get it out of their country and go for renewables for their own health and not not just like, it's not an environmental issue anymore. It's like whether or not they survive. And so it's a really big deal there.
Do you sense that the Chinese government is feeling that pressure
Yeah.
from below?
Yeah.
Yeah, you can tell, especially even from like foreign companies. Like no one wants to build their like headquarters in Beijing and then send, which is unfortunate, but like when people like large companies build in Beijing, like people from Western nations are going there, and Western nations don't want to be breathing that type of air. And so it's like there's the rising middle class in China that's really starting to demand public health assistance, as well as like companies saying we're not going to build in your country if it's going to like kill our people that we're sending over there.
Yeah, your up and coming execs aren't going to want to go there
Exactly.
to pad their resume and then die of an asthma attack.
Right.
That doesn't help. Were there young people from China, in India, and some of these other countries there in Paris with y'all?
Yeah. There were people from all over the world. And so Chinese Youth Climate Action Network was a big organization that was there, as well as Youth Inc. from China. And both of them were pretty prominent and had been helping work with the negotiators.
Yeah, there was I think a pretty significant student showing there. There were a lot of students from all over the world. I know that I met students from Taiwan, Korea, China, Italy. A bunch of the European nations were there because it was so accessible having the conference in Paris. So I think that it's really important that we have a lot of youth going to these conferences. And I think that as people in our generation are kind of coming of age and taking more powerful positions, it's really gaining a lot of political traction for these issues because we've grown up with movies like An Inconvenient Truth by Al Gore. We see that, and we've been experiencing that since we were young. And I think that having this next generation who's more aware is going to be really important looking forward.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, you're going to experience it. Because when it's getting really bad, I'm going to be dying of old age and saying, good luck, cowboy, and it's going to be on you guys. You're going to have to pay the price and deal with the consequences.
Actually, the second week of March, there are 21 youth, specifically children, actually, that are suing the U.S. government to work and act on climate, which is really cool. And that lawsuit is going to play out throughout the year of 2016.
Yeah, no, I think that's brilliant because you think about who's making the decisions about opening new coal plants, building new coal mines, drilling new wells. You know, those execs are average age 55, 60, 65. They're not going to be around when it gets really bad. They're going to be gone. And it's the kids who are going to be suing them that are going to have to pick up the pieces.
And I think that there was a youth movement. A lot of young people were being activists about environmental issues in the 70s. And it was really effective. We had a lot of major pieces of legislation passed, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act. And that's kind of fallen by the wayside after those major pieces of legislation were enacted. And hopefully we're able to do that again, this time with climate issues as opposed to localized environmental issues.
And I think that's happening, like even with like the People's Climate March and the Pope coming out, and people are just starting to get in the streets, starting to get into offices of our senators, congresspeople in general. Like people are hearing about it, and you can see a total shift in attitude because like we're standing up, I think.
And we care.
Yeah.
We care a lot.
Yeah, well, I think the fact that the Clean Power Plan is now the law of the land is an example of a huge victory that I think is as significant, if not more so, than the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act of 1970.
Right.
Let me ask a sort of dumb question. You got all these students from all over the world. How do you talk to each other?
Well, I use listservs and like there's.
Well, but like when you're in Paris,
Oh,
and you got your Taiwanese buddy and your Chinese buddy and your Italian buddy, like what language do you talk?
So English was most of the time the common denominator. Lucky for us.
Yeah.
But as far as conquering the language barrier within the actual meetings, everyone has a small wireless device and headphones, and there were, I think, 8 different channels, and you could switch to your language. So within a lot of the higher profile meetings, the executives of companies and key negotiators were speaking in their native language, and then you were able to get a live feed translation in headphones.
Right.
How cool is that? Wow.
Yeah.
What do you know? Okay, well, you learn something new every day. Well, we're going to take a short break, and then we'll be back with this issue. We're going to watch another short video from the Sierra Club, and then back to Paris. See you in a minute. Hello and welcome back to Green Time. I'm your host, John Hickey with the Missouri Sierra Club. On today's episode, we're talking with Missouri young people who have attended United Nations climate negotiations, including the recent negotiations in Paris, to come up with an international response to climate change. And our guests now, we have Nick Annin and Rachel Westrate, who have both attended UN climate negotiations. And you're obviously not in Paris anymore. I don't think this is Paris. Now that you're home, what are you doing to bring what you learned there and make it real here? And let me start with you, Rachel.
Yeah, so the student group that I work with, Washington University Students for International Collaboration on the Environment, is really big on bringing the experience of the 6 to 8 students that we can send to the international conferences each year and having them present on, what is the experience like being at these conferences and what did they learn and what can they bring back? So we have been working really hard to have them create a presentation in which they can explain the Paris Agreement to people back here. And there will be a couple events during spring 2016 in which they'll give that presentation. We've also worked with the St. Louis Director of Sustainability, who's in charge of the sustainability plan for the city, on what are they doing at Paris, what are they doing in other cities around the globe, and how can we sort of adapt that back here. So we've really tried to work with not only WashU professors, but people from around the city to see where we want to be a resource to everyone. So we're going to these international conferences. We have the ability to communicate with people from all around the world. What does Missouri want to know? What does St. Louis want to know? And how can we help? So last year we had students who went to Lima, and we actually worked with a professor from the architecture school at Washington University who was doing river adaptation projects for the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers. And so we went and talked to people from all over about what they were doing about river adaptation, and then we're able to bring that back and sort of explain what we learned to him and talk a little bit about how those global measures can be more localized.
And given the huge floods we had this year, that was right on time.
It would have been more convenient if we could have implemented them all last year, but we're learning slowly but surely.
Good. Nick, what's your experience so far of bringing what you learned in Paris back home?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm actually, I work with a student organization called Net Impact on campus, and it's a sustainable business organization. And one thing that we're doing this semester is we are bringing prominent business leaders from around St. Louis region, people from Monsanto, for example, professors, and we're all bringing them together to talk about the agricultural implications of climate change, and on top of that, how businesses can be working within the ag industry to help change practices potentially and switch up how we're producing food so that we're going to be able to meet demand with the coming changing climate.
Great. Well, thank you. The youth are doing great stuff. Gives me some confidence in the future. Thanks for watching Green Time. We'll see you next week.